Today we are here under the title of Towards the G20 in South Africa, and to discuss Africa's challenges, particularly in energy and climate change, as well as development potential. We wanted to do this discussion today because in few days the G20 in South Africa is starting. It is an historical event because it is the first time that a G20 is hosted in an African country. And basically it's the first time an African country leads an agenda and the discussions not only on global stage, but on global issues. And this goes to the credit of South Africa for being the most modern African economy, but also for being a mature democracy, a political system that at the moment is in a coalition that is working between former enemies, former opponents, and now partners in governments, the ANC and the Democratic Alliance. And basically also reflects the potentials of having partnership with South Africa, not only on bilateral issues, especially Italy and South Africa interest in promoting strategic relationships in fields like agriculture, energy, health, capacity building, themes that are also subject of the Matthijs Plan, but also a partnership with South Africa on continental and when there are the possibility also on global issues. This specific G20 looks like, we will know more today, but looks like a G20 focus on an agenda from the perspective of the Global South. Solidarity, equality, sustainability is the theme of the G20. Decided by South Africa. At the time of Trump, they looks like old world. So it will be interesting how the dynamics will unfold. Actually, the United States is the one who will take the leadership of the G20 after South Africa. We will have a conversations already, a summit in few days by all the ministers of finance of the 20 countries discussing reform of international financial institutions and organizations, most likely with South Africa pushing for a more equal institutional financial architecture at world level. But also bringing back at the center of the attention, at the center of the discussions, the issue of sustainability, renewable energy, and climate change. Issues that are the core also of Italy's Matthijs Plan for Africa, and that will be the subject of the discussions today. So I'm very glad to welcome here Jakkie Cilliers, who is the founders of the Institute for Security Studies, an African organization based in South Africa, but with offices in Nairobi, Addis Ababa, Dakar. 35 years old. He has been the founder. He has been the executive director. He's still the chairman of the board, but today he has decided to focus his time as head of the African Future and Innovation Program, basically developing analysis and foresight on issues as energy, climate change, but also agriculture and many other fields that he will expose today on a long term. It is the only African think tank and institutions with the capacity to go as deep in all these issues. They are also very capable and very proficient in the media on all African security issues. I'm confident to say they are probably one of the best African research institutes and think tanks. So We are also glad as a Medor Italian Foundation to have signed an MOU and to start more fruitful cooperations on research, joint event, and organizations of conference. I do believe that given the attentions that in Italy we have on Africa today and the strategic importance of Africa, it is an asset for our country to have institutions like ISS and to have personality like Jakkie Cilliers to come and to basically strengthen our approach to Africa also through scientific research. Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Jakkie. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and an honor to be in Rome. I haven't been here for many years. Umberto, as he said, I am the chairman of the ISS Board of Trustees, but I work full-time at the Institute heading a program called African Futures and Innovation, and we do long-term forecasting. Everything I'm going to tell you is on this website. I say that because I'm going to show you a few charts, a few graphs, and it's all on the website. There are two reports at the back. The one is on energy, and the other one is on climate. They have the same cover, so look at the name. My apologies for the similarity. So this is the front page of the website that I'm showing you. And I'm going to talk to you in three brief segments. In the first segment, I'm going to speak a little bit about our global forecasts and a few remarks about the G20 and BRICS and so on. Then I want to talk about Africa and the world, a little bit about the G20, and then the longer and the more substantive part of my presentation is really looking at Africa's energy and climate futures. So this website was launched in 2022 by President Ramaphosa and the head of the NEPAD agency in South Africa. NEPAD is the New Partnership for Africa's Development. So NEPAD has a long-term vision out till 2063 of Africa's future. It's in actual fact a 100-year vision that looks back 50 years to the establishment of the Organization of African Unity in 1963. NEPAD was established in 2013 and looks forward 50 years till 2063. So the Africa Union's long-term vision is known as Agenda 2063, and it is implemented in 10-year plans and quite a challenge bringing 53, 54 African countries and territories together. So if you look at this website, you will find every African country there. And you can scroll down and interrogate, for example, South Africa, or you can look at the themes. I'm going to very briefly speak about some of our global forecasts. It's known as Africa and the world. Let me first explain. There is a current path. The current path is the business as usual forecast, how we expect things to unfold. The business as usual or current path forecast. I'm going to use that term quite a bit. And there are different themes under that, but I'm going to speak about Africa and the world. What I'm showing you is on the website, and you can very easily access it from there. So let me first explain a little bit about what we do. This is what we do. We forecast the long-term future of every African country, and we analyze 17 themes. A theme would be education, or manufacturing, or the implementation of the Continental Free Trade Area. And we do that in line with the Africa Union's Agenda 2063 long-term vision for Africa. that I explained is implemented or executed in 10-year plans starting in 2013. We use a global forecasting platform known as International Futures. It is hosted and developed at the University of Denver. I'm not going to tell you more about the forecasting platform, but I want to tell you where the data comes from. It has more than 6,000 data sets in it. It's a massive algorithm that allows you to look where trends are going, to build scenarios, and so on. That is what we do. We first look bottom at the current path, the business as usual forecast. Where is a country going? Our business as usual forecast. And then once we determine that, then we look at 8 sectors. What is the impact of an aggressive positive scenario in demographics and health? What is the impact of an agricultural revolution? What is the impact of better quality and more education? What is the impact of a manufacturing transition, of infrastructure and leapfrogging, of the full implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, more inward financial flows consisting of aid, foreign direct investment, remittances, and less illicit financial outflows? What is the impact on Africa's development of better governance? When you put these things together, now remember, what we do is we build a single positive scenario on each of these 8 sectors for every African country. That's why there is more than 4,000 charts on the website, almost 1 million words of text. And when you put that together, we give an indication of what is Africa's development potential. Let me illustrate. So some of the countries that have done the best is, for example, Rwanda and Ethiopia, that have done the best in education, in the provision of healthcare. So these are both low-income countries. So we would say if Rwanda and Ethiopia can achieve this in the provision of maternal healthcare, can other low-income countries achieve the same improvement? That's how we benchmark and forecast. So we are asking what is possible in each of these 8 sectors. When we put it together, we come to a conclusion of Africa's development potential. What is possible? Once we have done that, we look at the impact of those scenarios on employment and jobs. Will Africa, in a high-growth scenario, be able to provide enough employment for its population? We look at the impact of gender on development. What is the impact of equity in education, in employment, on development? We look at energy, which I'm going to speak about today, and we look at the impact of climate change, and we look at how global developments will impact on Africa, because Africa does not exist in isolation. What happens elsewhere in the world has an impact on Africa. Every morning we wake up to see something new has happened on X. Trump has done this, or he's done that. The world, what happens elsewhere, has an impact. So I'm going to say a few words on Africa and the world, also to show you a little bit of the work that we've done. So we first look at power. How has power changed? Not electric power or energy, but material power, soft power, hard power. So we use various indices of power. So let's imagine there's 100% power in the world. How does that change? Our forecasts would indicate that China would overtake the United States as the most powerful country in the world before mid-century, around 2043, around there. But of course, the West is more than the US and China, and depending on your point of view, China does not have the same global policing ambitions, perhaps, that the United States developed over many years. It is likely that the West will continue to dominate in wealth, attraction, and technology, but it is losing its ability to shape the world order, and it is increasingly fighting amongst itself, like the Roman Empire, one would argue. So, with the growth of the global south, the future is likely more regional. regions are disconnecting from the global commons. So it's a complex multipolarity and a growing divide between the rich West and the rest. Governments in liberal democracies are losing authority and power to the private sector. So is Elon Musk the president, or is Trump the president? The ability of autocracies to buy off the desire for self-actualization through rapid economic growth is declining. Will China be able to resist the inevitable pressure for democratization that comes with improvements in income? Because a free economy requires a free politics. And China is defying gravity at the moment. And in many poor countries, non-traditional groups are competing for state power, particularly where growth is slow. Look at what's happening in West Africa, in the Sahel countries, with the takeover of military governments, the ejection of France and others. Look at the Eastern Congo, where various factions are fighting for power because Kinshasa does not control what happens on its eastern border with Rwanda. So, how do you make sense of this world? We take two divisions: the extent of globalization, the extent of sustainability, an interconnected globalized world versus nationalist populism as one extreme on the y-axis. On the x-axis, we say the extent of sustainability, because we cannot predict. We can frame a world so you can think about it. And that gives us four worlds: a sustainable world, a divided world, a world at war, and a growth world. These are some of the characteristics of these worlds. On the website, there is a long explanation and analysis of this world and how we did this modeling. So a sustainable world, a rules-based world, sustainable development goals are implemented, the UN remains important. Sustainability with regard to carbon and the energy transition. But we are more likely, at the moment, we certainly are in a heading towards a divided world, which is a fragmented world of clubs. The G20, well, the G7, the BRICS, and other non-aligned movement, and so on. This is a world where bickering between the US and the European Union intensifies. And there's no global consensus on climate change, mitigation, and adaptation is weak. So the gap between a rich West and a global South widens, rising xenophobia and anti-migrant sentiment. But that world is much better than the world at war. In a growth world, as we see happening, technology and money dominates. The pursuit of profit replaces democracy, elected power. And it is very possible that the one scenario can morph into another. For example, if the United States decides to enter into a grand bargain with China in dividing the world amongst themselves, because they have much more complementarity, for example, than between the US and the European Union, a very different world can emerge. So this is the size of the African economy and the economy of the rest of the world in market exchange rates in 2020 on the left-hand side, and in 2043 for a divided world, a growth world, a sustainable world, and a world at war. So the African economy, which is about $2.4 trillion US dollars in 2020, could get to about $8.7 trillion in a sustainable world. So Africa is a small player economically, but as you know, our population is growing very rapidly. The carbon emissions in these scenarios are very different. So on the left-hand side, it shows carbon emissions compared to the current path forecast in a growth world where carbon emissions increase because it's drill, baby, drill. It's the use of oil, coal, and gas. Whereas in a sustainable world, carbon emissions are much lower. Yet, on the right-hand side, GDP per capita, there's very little difference between the two scenarios. This just shows the difference between the scenarios in terms of sustainability versus the economic size. Of course, a sustainable world is much more difficult to achieve because it requires leadership. It requires taking on the oil and gas industry and all kinds of things. So the war in Ukraine, the fear of China's rising influence, and events in Gaza have had significant collateral effects. The global south and the developed north divide is growing. Yet Africans need China. It's our largest trading partner. It's the only country that really invests in building of infrastructure. We need the European Union. Together, Europe is our largest trading partner. Trade with Europe is much higher value than trade with China, for example. And we need the United States. That's where the deep capital is. Even as our developmental interests will increasingly be towards rising China. There are many Europeans and others that want Africans to choose. Africa will not choose. It cannot choose. Yes, it will say certain things, but we need all the help we can get. That's why Africa remains on the margins when it comes to Ukraine and to other issues. So, that's the first part. As Umberto indicated, South Africa is the chair of the G20. It is also one of the original members of the BRICS partnership, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa. And we are struggling, we are inheriting the G20 after Brazil and India, and as you indicated, the United States is supposed to take over from us end of this year. Yet, at the moment, we have a meeting of the foreign ministers of the G20 that are supposed to happen later this month, and the US Secretary of State said, I'm not attending. And he is not attending part for a variety of reasons. But South Africa is at odds with the US on a number of areas. And President Ramaphosa, who is a very astute negotiator and facilitator, will have to manage a very, very difficult environment. Let's list a few of the areas where we are at odds with the United States. The most important one, of course, is on Israel. South Africa has been at the forefront of taking Israel to the International Court of Justice, condemning and pointing to the extent of the genocide that is happening. And of course, we know what the US interests are and alliances are with Israel, and South Africa is clearly seen to be at odds with the United States, with the Trump administration in particular, on Israel. And that certainly lies at the back of many of the issues that we see, because South Africa has also been very close in its relationships with China and with Russia. For historical reasons, Russia, many of the ANC leadership were trained in Russia, actually in Ukraine to be quite accurate, ironically. But South Africa has the ANC has a particular loyalty towards Russia and Cuba because of the role that these countries played in South Africa's liberation. And then we are also at odds with the United States on Rwanda. You may remember there's this issue that's happened in the eastern DRC. South Africa has 2,000 troops deployed as part of a SADC, Southern African Development Community, peace mission in the DR Congo. We have spent hundreds of millions of dollars, which, ask me, is a lot of money, trying to bring peace to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But nobody governs the eastern part of the Congo. Eastern part of the Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, is much more economically part of Rwanda and those countries than it is of Kinshasa, which lies 1,700 kilometers to the west. Nobody governs. So the interests, so Rwanda has got specific interests in the eastern Congo, and because there's no government, and because it fears a Hutu rebellion from the eastern Congo, all kinds of problems. Let me not go into that too much. But Rwanda is a close ally of the United States, and by the way, of Israel in Africa. On Morocco, if there is a third issue beyond Russia and Cuba that South Africa, that the ANC loves, it is the Western Sahara, the Sahrawi Republic. And so South Africa is the most important defender of independence for the Western Sahara. And you know what has happened, that the United States, that Morocco has eventually agreed to recognize Israel in exchange for the United States recognizing that the Western Sahara is a part of Morocco. So, problems. There are many other issues. Elon Musk, as you know, a guy who works very close to Trump, grew up in South Africa. And he is obviously advising Trump. And then recently, about a few days ago, Donald Trump placed an embargo on any aid to South Africa. Now, South Africa got $434 million per year from PEPFAR on HIV/AIDS. It's not been stopped, but it certainly, after 90 days, may not carry on. So, lots of issues around South Africa and how we are going to manage the G20 presidency. Will Donald Trump come to Pretoria or Johannesburg to take over the G20 presidency from Cyril Ramaphosa, given all these issues? So I think a lot of work lies ahead. President Ramaphosa is a very astute negotiator. He is calm, collected. We will see what happens. I think that we will manage the process, but what I'm pointing about, it is difficult. So that's a bit of background to some of the issues that I wanted to speak about. Now, with regard to Africa and the world, global context, and all of this kind of stuff. So now I want to speak a little bit about energy and climate. So what I'm going to show you, it's on the website. I go to the energy theme on the website, and I go to what we refer to as the slider, and I'm going to speak a little bit about Africa's climate challenges and energy demands. So, without energy, you cannot develop. Because we compare nuclear energy with hydro energy, with solar, wind, and so on and so forth, we convert energy into barrels of oil equivalent. It's just a way of comparing energy from different sources with one another. Rapid human development requires about 8.6 barrels of oil equivalent per person annually. Okay, Africa currently is on an average of about 3.2 barrels of oil equivalent. The rest of the world is about 13.6. That is 4 times what the African average is. And remember that Africa has got a very rapidly growing population. So we come from energy poverty with a growing population. That is, energy demand is going to go through the roof. There are about 20 African states that produce 4% of the world's coal, 10% of the world's oil, and 7.6% of the world's gas. And there we have listed them. South Africa is by far the largest coal exporter and producer. It's one of the largest in the world. We are very coal dependent and with all kinds of problems that relate to that. This is energy demand per person. On the left-hand side, this is Africa, India, China, the European Union, the US. It is for 2023, 2050, and 2063. So Africa, coming from the 3.2 barrels of oil per person, this is per person, you can see how that increases. 2023, 2050, even by 2063, on the current path forecast, on business as usual, Africa's energy demand per person is very, very low. Per person. Look at India, compare that to China, the European Union, and the United States. If we were then to look at total energy demand, remember that was per person, this is total. Then look at the difference Africa's large population makes. Suddenly, by 2063, total energy demand from Africa, this is 20 billion barrels of oil equivalent, is higher than that of India, It is much higher, it's almost double that of the European Union and higher than the United States. The only country that compares, that has a larger energy demand than Africa is China. Just to place that in context. So what happens if Africa develops more rapidly, as we all hope and expect it to do? Africa's energy is very inefficient. And one of the reasons why it is inefficient is because we don't have grid. So we are not connected like Europe, where energy in one country can offset the demand elsewhere. This is Africa's energy grid. It is planned and existing. And you can see, look at the gap that there exists. Remember that if I take planned away, it really looks quite meager. So there is, in southern Africa, a degree of energy demand, but a degree of grid, but in much of the rest of Africa, very limited grid. And you need a grid to be able to transfer surplus energy from one area to another. The result of this is that Africa loses about 30% of its energy just purely because of inefficiency in its, particularly electricity production. We don't have pipelines, so we can't transport gas, oil in particular. And these are the oil and the gas pipelines in Africa. A little bit on the coastline, interior, nothing. What does that mean? That means that energy in Africa is transported by road and by truck. Hugely inefficient. So Africa, one of the areas where we can make real significant progress is simply by grid connection. Given its rapidly growing population and the forecast of large increases in energy demand, Africa must embark on a low emissions pathway from fossil in its own and global interests. Because Africa comes from a low base, we are quite fossil dependent. As we grow, our energy demand will increase very rapidly, with implications for carbon emissions and so on. This is our forecast of global energy production. In coal, oil, gas, hydro, nuclear, geothermal, other renewables, wind and solar. This is for the world. It is in billion barrels of oil equivalent. So our forecast is that coal remains important. Gas remains important. Sorry, oil remains important. Gas, in actual fact, increases. And then you can, towards the end of the forecast horizon, which is 2040, 2063, you can see how renewables take off. This is what we think is going to happen as opposed to what we wish would happen. This is Africa's energy forecast in a current path forecast, a business as usual forecast. Remember that this is now, it's again in billion barrels of oil equivalent. You can see our limited use of coal, oil, gas is increasing, and then you can see the massive forecast increase in renewables, in oil and in wind and solar towards the end of the forecast horizon. If I were to place that in percent of total, the current path forecast of the energy transition in Africa becomes even more apparent. So coal at the bottom, followed by oil, followed by gas. Remember, a significant portion of our oil, coal, and gas is exported. Africa is a net exporter of energy. And you can see how particularly solar escalates towards the end of our forecast horizon. Just to give you an idea of what, when we speak about current path forecast, what that means, the business as usual forecast. Of course, this will be wrong. We don't have a magic wand in which we can predict. We can try and model and forecast. Remember what I told you what we do on our website. We look at the current path, and I've shown you the current path. That's the bottom arrow. And then we model 8 sectors, and we say this is the development potential for Africa. So what I now want to show you is to compare the current path forecast with the combined scenario, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. So that is the size of the African economy on the left-hand side in 2023, and in 2043 on the current path, and to remind you what it would look like in the combined scenario. So instead of a combined scenario, a current path forecast of an African economy that is $7.3 trillion, it could be 10.8 trillion. That's our development potential in the combined scenario, just to remind you. This is what our carbon emissions would look like. Of course, with that growing population and demand for energy, our carbon emissions will increase. But still, 1.1 billion tons of carbon by 2043 on the high growth forecast. That's what it looks like if I compare energy demand and production in the current path on the left-hand side versus the combined scenario on the right-hand side. I know this is many charts and many things, and I know it's a bit overwhelming, but that's, what it shows you is the demand and production of energy in Africa on the current path on the left-hand side versus a high-growth combined scenario on the right-hand side. If I compare Africa's energy demand in the current path versus the combined scenario, the green line with the dots in it, that's what it looks like on the combined scenario versus the current path which is there. So a huge increase, so that by 2063, Africa's energy demand approaches that of China. So what do we do about this? What we've done is we have, amongst others, modeled various a global carbon tax. Because we have already built into our current path forecast various measures to try and reduce carbon emissions and to enhance Africa's energy transition. But it is not enough. Without a global carbon tax, the world will not get close to 2.2 degrees, never mind 1.5. So these are 4 different global carbon tax scenarios that we've modeled, where only the wealthy countries pay a carbon tax, where only the big polluters pay a carbon tax, where everybody pays a carbon tax, or where you have a carbon tax, the differentiated pay scenario, where low income, low middle, upper middle, and high income countries pay a different price per ton of carbon. Because how else are you going to move the world onto a sustainable trajectory, particularly given Africa's growing demand, but not only Africa? If we do that, and we combine and we add that carbon tax to our combined scenario, we get what we refer to as a sustainable Africa scenario. On the left-hand side, there's a list of what we've done in the scenario. We've reduced energy exports, we've expanded geothermals and other renewables, we have bumped up nuclear and hydro energy, very aggressive additional expansion of solar and wind, in addition to what I showed you on the current path. Ongoing investments in oil and increased investment in gas, reduction in coal investment, more energy efficiency, and forest protection and regeneration. Because one of Africa's strategic offerings on carbon is the extent to which we can serve as a carbon sink for the rest of the world. And how do we monetize that? So that's what's in the combined scenario. Then we add to that the differentiated carbon tax scenario that I've shown you. I know this is a bit much. And that gives us a sustainable Africa scenario. Summary of all of this modeling is that Africa needs support for a slower transition from fossil fuels. Africa, it is impossible. United Nations Environmental Programme brought out a study about 1.5 years ago in which it said, if you want to keep 1.5 degrees alive, you have to end coal production by 2040, and you have to reduce oil and gas by 2050 by about 2/3. Africa can't do that. It's impossible. So, and its emissions are going to grow, its energy demand is going to grow. So by 2050, Africa would require about 13% of global carbon emissions and about 22% by 2063. If the world wants a sustainable transition, it needs to give space for Africa. Remember, we use much less energy. Remember that number of 3.2 barrels of oil per person versus 13 barrels per person for the rest of the world? And you need energy to grow, to develop. So this is a huge challenge. I'm going to stop there. I have thrown enough charts at you. What I've tried to do is I've started off by speaking to you a little bit about Africa in a global context. I sought to answer the question how global developments potentially impact on Africa. And I hope I've shown you that what happens in the rest of the world has a huge impact on Africa. In poverty, in GDP per capita, carbon emissions, everything. Africa is part and parcel of that world, and we are in a slow growth world. Slow growth has a huge impact on the continent. Then we spoke a little bit about South Africa, G20, BRICS, the challenges that we face in managing a Trumpian world. And then the last part, I've shown a lot of charts and confused all of you by trying to show you what is Africa's future in terms of a current path on energy, using different types of energy. Then I said, and what is Africa's growth potential, and what is the carbon emissions and energy of that high growth, and then what could we do about that? And I've tried to show a little bit of the impact of a global carbon tax on that. Without a global carbon tax, you can't really you can't create the space for Africa's development potential. So, I am going to stop there. I hope I have not that everybody hasn't fallen to sleep, but thanks very much for listening to me. Ready to answer any questions and issues.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon. My name is Marco Massoni. I teach African politics at Lewis University. Approaching the South African presidency, I mean, from the website, from the insight, we know that there are three priorities labeled as pivotal, which is inclusive growth, economic. We're talking about, of course, the G20, I would say 21 actually, summit and year of presidency, of course. So priority number one, inclusive economic growth, industrialization, employment, and reduce inequality. And number two, to me, is very important, is food security. I wouldn't get back to Amilcar Cabral food sovereignty, but the idea of food security for a growing population in accordance with the requirements of the energy transition is at stake. I think this is fundamentally important also for political stability in many countries. You can look at problems in Africa and other parts of the world from different perspectives, but I would say that to me, especially also after the Italian G7 presidency, which gave pretty much importance to that, food security would be important. If you could elaborate something about it. And just to end it up, the number three priority, of course, is I'm working for the South African government right now, artificial intelligence, innovation for sustainable development. Thank you so much.
So while you were speaking, I went to our agricultural theme on the website, and there's a significant amount of forecasting that we've done. We Africans love to speak about agriculture, and we love to do nothing about it. Africa has not had an agricultural revolution, and agriculture is foundational to development. Without food security, you will not develop. And Africa is becoming more food insecure with each passing year. We have the world's largest potential in arable land, and we have the lowest yields per hectare of any country, of any continent. There is one exception, of course, Egypt, which uses the Nile River. So if you click on the left-hand side, you will find a whole issue around Africa's, the lack of an agricultural revolution in Africa. Agriculture was foundational to China's evolution, rapid, to India, to Brazil, to all of them. And Africa needs to embark. It is also the area where we have the most potential. But what we've often tried to do in the continent is to industrialize without getting the the basics the basics in place. In actual fact, you can't go up the manufacturing curve without an agricultural revolution, because the normal way of getting up that curve, that ladder, is through agro-processing and so on and so forth. And there are many plans, CAADP, Comprehensive African Agricultural Plan, and so on. But it is the area that requires the most focus. It is also the area that can play the largest role in poverty reduction. So it is vitally important. Yeah. But you can read all about it and look at the various charts and issues that we do on agriculture. Other questions that I can confuse you? It's always difficult when somebody shows a lot of charts, I know that. And it's a bit intimidating to look at all these charts and the numbers and the issues. But they are not a prediction. They are just one set of thinking about the future that is possible. What we try and do, we are on Friday, this Friday in Addis Ababa, we are releasing forecasts on, updated forecasts on Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, Guinea. There's one that I'm missing. I'm not sure. In any case, 5 countries that we've just been updating, or the 5 coup-affected countries, to see how you engage with these countries that have ejected France, entered into a partnership with Russia, but that does nothing to their development. And why has that happened? That has happened because growth is low and democracy has not delivered. The quality of democracy in those countries, of course, is very low. But unless we can find a way of creating that link between democracy and growth, I think the West is going to struggle, and Africa's friends in Italy and elsewhere are going to struggle. So the ability of democracy to provide development, I think, is one of the challenges that we face. Because statistically, at low levels of development for poor countries, democracy doesn't have much of an impact, in actual fact. As you go up the curve, it starts to have an impact. But the promise of democracy has not been fulfilled. I'm sorry.
No worries. Thank you for being
space.
here in the first place. My name is Francesco Mariano. I work as a political analyst for the Medor Foundation, primarily following North Africa. And I would have liked to get back to the issue of food security. And I would be curious to know specifically what you think the impact of the growing fertilizer market in Africa, I'm primarily thinking about Morocco, of course, will be, especially in connection with its water-intensive production. Is phosphate fertilizer going to play a larger role in the future? Will its market be sustainable in the long run? Even as we see right now, its growing importance as a trump card for Morocco in its relations with Kenya in the race for the African Union. So, food for thought, I guess.
The short answer to that question is yes, it is very important. India, Brazil, China, all the countries that have increased production have done so through extensive use of fertilizer. We import most of our fertilizer. Yes, there are the big plants that have come online in Nigeria and elsewhere. Africa needs lots of fertilizer. Yes, it needs to invest in a circular economy and all those kind of things, and that eventually will be the future. But Africa also needs genetically modified grains, because we need to find ways of protecting us against the impact of climate change, which is going to be huge. We don't have coping capacity and ability. And then the third one, which I've already mentioned, is the movement towards a circular economy. So fertilizer, modified seeds, circular economy, hugely important on the continent. And of course, none of this, yeah, we can, I mean, North Africa faces particular problems because of the lack of regional integration, because of the Western Sahara. Unless that issue, you can unlock that issue. North Africa remains dependent upon trade with the European Union. And that is a problem for a developing region if it does not trade with itself and go up that barrier.
Thank you. My name is Giuseppe Morabito. I'm head of research at CIOI, International Society for Italian Society for International Organization. Demography. Everybody's talking about demography. Many people say 2050 Africa will double its population. I'm not so sure that we can make forecasts in such a long term, especially as demography is concerned. I remember at the time when I was quite young, in the 70s, Edward was saying in 2000 there'll be no more oil. Now we have more oil than before. Anyway, how do you evaluate these forecasts about demography? I've already seen that in some even sub-Saharan countries the fertility rate is lowering. So what is your assessment about the forecast and especially also about the relationship between demographic trends in Africa and economic development? Thank you.
Hugely important issue that you are raising. So I'm going to explain this through a chart. Countries grow, so at low levels of development, the size of your labor force is very important. The size of your labor force relative to the size of your total population. For low-income countries, the size of your labor force, 15 to 64, versus dependents, children, and elderly, can explain up to 2/3 of growth. So growth comes from 3 factors: labor, capital, and technology. If you are a low-income country, you get most of your economic growth from labor. You get it when the ratio of working-age people to dependents, 15 years to 64 years, versus children and the elderly, gets to 1.7 working age to 1. When you get above that ratio, you start growing rapidly because at low levels of development, labor makes the largest contribution to growth. Then as you grow and you become a middle-income country, capital becomes more important. And eventually, technology. Until you are old, like Europe, when you have to use technology to compensate for your low levels of labor. And you have to start importing labor from Africa or from elsewhere, or you have to use technology to compensate. So this chart shows the ratio of working-age people to dependents for China, India, and Nigeria. Nigeria is Africa's country with the largest population. In 20 years' time, 1 in every 8 people in the world will be Nigerian. So, this area, that area which is colored, is the 1.7. That's the 1.7 line. So when your ratio of working age people to dependents gets to 1.7 to 1, then your population pyramid looks like the Taj Mahal. It's nice and fat in the middle. That's when you grow. If your population pyramid looks like the Eiffel Tower, exaggerated, you don't grow. You don't grow GDP per capita. Your economy grows, but incomes don't grow because the ratio of working age people to dependents is not high enough. China, one of the main reasons why China grew so rapidly is because it peaked at about 2.7 working age people to every dependent in 2009. Because labor makes the largest contribution to growth at low levels of development. Now it's declining. India will peak at about 2.2 people per working age people to every dependent. India will never grow as rapidly as China. Nigeria will peak at 1.9 working age people to every dependent in 2088. Nigeria will remain poor. That's how important demographics is. Of course, this is a forecast. But labor, demographics, there's a saying, demographics is destiny. What happens demographically is hugely important. So people underestimate the contribution that demographics had to China's growth, what it will have in India's growth, and the way that demographics is condemning Africans to poverty. On average, Africa only enters a demographic window of opportunity of 1.7 working age people to every dependent in 2052. We are more than 2 decades away from entering a potential window of demographic opportunity. This is hugely important. So, sir, the issue that you raise, very important. That penny is starting to drop in Africa. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, when you spoke of demographics in the way that I'm speaking about it, Africans, you have to approach it from a growth perspective, not from a population control or social perspective. Because it's not a question, it's a question of education and gender equity and so on that changes demographics. But demographics is going to be very important for Africa's growth potential for the reason. Remember what I said. At low levels of development, most of your economic growth comes from your size of your labor force relative to your dependent population. You need to grow your population, that your population pyramid does not look like the Eiffel Tower, that it looks like the Taj Mahal, so that labor contributes to growth. Sorry, it's an issue that's very, very important.
Maybe I have a question. And I didn't introduce myself before. My name is Umberto Tavolato. I'm the Director of International Special Projects here at the Medor Foundation. So, a current issues, which is, decisions by the Trump administrations to halt or stop US aid. What's the main impact on Africa? Which sectors, most likely health, is most affected? And if through your research and graphics, you can somehow give a prediction on how this is going to play out, I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
So one of the areas that we forecast is what is the impact of financial inward flows on Africa's development. So financial inward flows consists of aid. Aid mostly goes to low-income countries. Foreign direct investment, which mostly goes to middle and high-income countries, and remittances, and also illicit financial flows. Those are the 4 components that we forecast. Aid for Africa is still important, particularly for low-income countries. Make no mistake. That aid goes to alleviate poverty, to try and help with health and education, because foreign direct investment does not go to low-income countries. There is this myth that if we unlock the private sector, it will develop Africa. No. The private sector, particularly Western private sector, does not invest in poor African countries. There is some business there, but foreign direct investment goes to middle-income countries. Africa has got 8 upper middle-income countries, 22 lower middle-income countries, and 24 low-income countries. So aid is still important for Africa, unpopular as that may be. The United States is the largest provider of aid worldwide, although a significant portion of its aid is humanitarian assistance. And what is going to happen, of course, so the US has put a freeze on aid to Africa. There is now a 90-day moratorium, as you know. Let me just kill this thing. And they are making decisions on where this is going to go. But it is going to have a huge impact on Africa. It's going to squeeze out funding from other foundations. The European Union and others are going to be asked to fill the gap, private foundations. And it is going to, well, let me give you an example. South Africa is an upper middle income country. We get $440 million per year for HIV/AIDS. And many of those people, that's 17%, we have the largest HIV/AIDS population in the world, positive. Millions of South Africans are going to struggle. We have to find that money in our budget. And the reduction in aid, and aid works for low-income countries. There's huge issues around this, and it's got a bad name, but when it comes to low-income countries, it really makes a difference. And we have done some, by the way, some work to show what the impact is. I'll show you. This is financial flows. Let me show you what some of that is. Okay, percentage point reduction in aid, percentage point reduction in extreme poverty in Africa coming from aid. So these are mostly low percentage point of reduction in poverty rate. This is what the contribution that aid makes to reductions in extreme poverty in Africa. And the reduction of US aid, what does the US give? 40 billion, 45, I can't remember. But it's a significant amount of money. It is going to have a huge impact on poverty reduction and on building government capacity, on investments in democracy and so on the continent. Have absolutely no doubt about this. It comes at a time when the aid industry is under pressure. Aid's gone out of fashion. Everybody believes that all that we need to do is unlock the private sector, and somehow the private sector is going to develop Africa. Not really. You cannot unlock the private sector without strong government. You need to build government capacity to be able to manage foreign direct investment and to manage aid flows and so on and so forth. So I think, well, the US is making a huge soft power error, I believe, in every sense imaginable. Not only fighting against its allies, but its reductions in aid, which will condemn, I think, millions of people are going to die as a result.
If I may add something, but from this very Mayor Trump's move, which was somewhat foreseeable during his campaign, I mean, this trend of figuring out a post-ODA, official development assistance world, was already there, because even we, us, Europeans, are making strategic decisions bilaterally, multilaterally, and multilaterally on what countries, like-minded countries, to what extent, to what term, to help them making decisions, even because of budget available, and think about Mattei Plan, criteria to decide which countries to begin with were different, but in general, there is also this trend, and you can see that in Ethiopia with the European Union, you know, we're clauses of democratic capacity are less and less relevant. There is this risk to really, so Trump made it hard in a way,
Yeah.
but I don't know whether you have a similar feeling. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's a problem we're having here. But from the percentage of DG&E or GDP every OECD DAC countries dedicates to the international development assistance in itself.
I think that was more of a comment than a question. But yeah.
I think it's past our time, and and I really wanted to thank you again for being here and for being able to respond on such a different range of issues. It speaks volume to the work of ISS, and I think it's the beginning of a longer cooperation, not only with MEDOR, but also with Italy and the various stakeholders and institutions. So I would really like to thank you again for your presence and for you being here. Thank you very much.